There's a detail in SpongeBob that forever changed how I see the show. One of Mermaid Man's running gags in the earlier seasons was for him to panic and cry out the word at the mere thought of evil. Except that's not exactly what it is. In Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 2, the heroes talk about villains with SpongeBob, and even run into two villains they had a history with. If anything would trigger Mermaid Man, it would be them. But Mermaid Man stays level-headed throughout the episode. So what is it that triggers Mermaid Man's panic attacks? It's the presence of one oddly specific character, Patrick Star. In the first Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episode, Mermaid Man gets triggered when SpongeBob and Patrick both visit them at the retirement home. Then SpongeBob goes by himself. And while Mermaid Man is senile, he doesn't panic. At the end of the episode, SpongeBob and Patrick are together again, and the heroes spend time with only SpongeBob in their second episode, so we know SpongeBob isn't the trigger. But then in Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 3, the episode where SpongeBob and Patrick are house-sitting for the superheroes, Patrick jumps into the scene, and right on cue, evil! The show seems to go out of its way to show us that there's a connection between Mermaid Man's panic attacks and Patrick being in his proximity, which is an oddly specific detail in a show without much consistency. And yes, I could write this off as happenstance, but why are Patrick and Mermaid Man the only two characters who know how to set Mermaid Man's utility belt to Wumbo?
When it should be set to W for Wumbo.
Did you set it to Wumbo?
SpongeBob was always set up as the bigger Mermaid Man fan, so this is something Patrick would have had to learn outside the fandom. The fact that he even has an idea of how Mermaid Man's utility belt works is a little suspicious. So I kept digging. Pieces of the puzzle kept coming together, and I am now convinced that Patrick Star used to be a supervillain, but not just any villain, the most dangerous foe that Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy have ever faced. Let's start with the obvious question. Does Patrick even have superpowers to be a supervillain? Yes. Ignoring general cartoon logic and zaniness, Patrick is shown to have abilities that definitively prove he's a superpowered individual. The sponge who could fly ends with Patrick flying away. No jetpacks, no inflatable pants. He raises his hand and floats into the sky. And in the world of SpongeBob, flight, or swimming, is an ability that only superheroes and supervillains are shown to have. Even land creatures like Sandy can't fly/swim like this. So Patrick is a super, but his powers don't end there. It's easy to forget that one of his defining traits is his strength.
Listen, you're big and strong.
I've hired some extra security.
We've seen Patrick outrun trains, slice whole buildings in half, and take down foes much larger than himself in his sleep. Patrick does lose fights to other characters, but this seems to happen because he's either in a state of panic or doesn't care enough to fight back. Because with the right motivation, we see Patrick's true abilities surface. In fact, Patrick's perceived laziness could be proof of how powerful he is. Muscles burn a lot of energy, even when the body's resting. This is why athletes have massive diets, even if they don't plan on working out that day. Likewise, Patrick frequently eats and sleeps because his body is always burning so much energy. I'm not exaggerating when I say that Patrick is consistently one of, if not the strongest characters in the world of SpongeBob. This also makes him one of the most dangerous. And if Mermaid Man's reactions are anything to go by, then there's reason to fear this friendly-looking starfish. But let's back up for a moment, because we're making a lot of assumptions. Even if Patrick has powers, that doesn't make him an ex-villain. He could just as easily be an ex-superhero, or more likely, a regular guy who has powers but never uses them. Except based on what we know about Patrick, those options don't sound as likely. Patrick is generally a nice guy, but he's also someone who abuses power whenever it's given to him. It's one of his few traits that's been consistent throughout the years. When SpongeBob pretends to be dumb so Patrick can look smart, Patrick uses his position of superiority to bully his best friend. Patrick becomes a cruel tyrant when people think he's the lost king of Bikini Bottom. He gains a superiority complex when he's granted intelligence with Brain Coral, and when he learns that he can cut anything with a single karate chop, he takes the opportunity to rob an ice cream shop and destroy the town for his own amusement. This is Patrick's pattern. He goes through this cycle of gaining power, using it selfishly, almost losing his friends as a result, then having to give it up. And no matter how many times he goes through this, Patrick continues to make the same mistake, time and time again. Do I think a character like this would be responsible with his powers? Or at least not use them to bully people? I honestly don't. It makes the most sense that Patrick would use all his gifts and powers to take whatever he wanted, especially a past version of himself that hasn't learned as much. And if this is how Patrick treats his friends, imagine how much damage he could do to his enemies. But while thinking it over, this pattern brings up something interesting. It shows that narratively, Patrick is weirdly also the hero of this story. He's acutely aware of his selfish tendencies, so when he takes things too far, he stops himself the only way he knows how, by removing that power so he can't abuse it. Patrick might not be able to remove his innate powers, but he seems to be doing the next best thing, constantly making himself forget about them. I want to bring up 2 spin-off games, Creature from the Krusty Krab and its PC version, Nighty Nightmare. Both games follow SpongeBob, Plankton, and Patrick through their dreams. SpongeBob and Plankton's are fairly simple. Our favorite yellow sponge gets his driver license, while Plankton becomes a kaiju-esque monster. These are even dreams we see the characters have in the show. But Patrick's dream is different, and dare I say, gives us a deeper look into how his mind works. Patrick dreams he's a superhero who protects citizens from a supervillain. But the twist is that this villain, the one constantly terrorizing the town, is another version of himself, named the Dreaded Patrick. Creature from the Krusty Krab doesn't do much with this villain, but Nighty Nightmare goes into way more depth with this storyline. Super Patrick chases the Dreaded Patrick to his secret lair, but when the hero gets there, he realizes only when it's too late that it's all been a trap. Super Patrick loses his powers and has to navigate a labyrinth of filth to fight his evil counterpart. If we're trying to understand Patrick's psyche from these dreams, this could be his way of reconciling with his past. His first dream is him stopping henchmen who are also versions of himself. If Patrick used to be a villain, this could be him trying to mentally clean up all the terrible things he did to Bikini Bottom and its residents. But even when all the henchmen are gone, the town isn't truly safe until Super Patrick leaves to Dreaded Patrick's evil lair. A lair that, at the end of the game, is revealed to be Super Patrick's own house. If it wasn't clear before that these are supposed to be 2 halves of the same person, this detail of sharing a home should cement that idea. And it's fascinating that this dream comes down to a battle between a hero without powers and a villain with powers. It shows us how Patrick views these 2 aspects of himself, and he only wins when his powerless self can triumph over the version of himself with power. And Patrick does so by making himself forget about the powers he has. Take this moment from Squidtastic Voyage as an example. Patrick comes up with the idea to get out of an otherwise inescapable problem, then formulates exactly how the plan is going to play out. He has a moment where he's the smartest person in the room, smarter than Sandy, but just a few seconds later, all he has to say is,
What plan?
And moments like this aren't rare. Patrick is constantly forgetting the things that he did or that people said to him just moments before. He suppresses a part of himself that's strong enough, smart enough, and dangerous enough to destroy everything he cares about. And Patrick is aware enough that having this power is too tempting for him. So he's constantly sacrificing his own mind, his own self, to protect his town, to protect his neighbors, and to protect his best friend in the deep blue sea. This theory explains so much of Patrick's seemingly random behaviors and abilities. The only real problem is that this theory implies that Patrick was Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy's old foe. And Patrick isn't nearly that old. We're shown that he's much closer in age to SpongeBob. But again, the show gives us a clear answer. Starfish can grow new versions of themselves from broken off body parts. A real-life biology fact that's also true in the SpongeBob universe. What's more is that these new versions have the powers of the original starfish. Patrick gets rid of his karate chopping hand because he can't handle that kind of power, and the hand that he pulled off turns into a starfish that has his karate chopping ability. What I think could have happened is that Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy faced off against the real-life Dreaded Patrick. Except they missed a single piece of the Dreaded Patrick, and that little piece grew into a new version of the villain, the starfish we know today. This new version grew up alongside SpongeBob, maybe unaware of who he was until much later in life. This is why the now elderly heroes can't recognize Patrick, but his presence is still enough to trigger Mermaid Man. This is why Patrick has moments of genuine brilliance that are forgotten a moment later. It's why he possesses strength and power that he himself seems constantly unaware of. He knows the villain he could become if he allowed himself to use this power.
For doing absolutely nothing longer than anyone else, Patrick, this trophy's for you!
And in a way, that sacrifice also makes Patrick one of Bikini Bottom's greatest heroes.